As part of Mental Health Week in 2020, the Fellowship of Australian Writers Queensland sat down with people from different backgrounds to discuss how the creative art of writing can help build resilience in life. Sandy O'Sullivan, transgender Wiradjuri First Nation Associate Professor in Creative Industries at USC Moreton Bay, begins by talking about creative industries and what it can offer for students.
Creative industries is an area that I've worked in and around for 29 years. The 29 years that I've been an academic, and it's transformed in that time. People often remember it being framed in universities as creative arts, and where it started to frame itself as industries was a connection to media. It was a connection to the industries that we work in, and it was a recognition that creative practice is absolutely a part of the engagement that we all do in industry. You know, that we're involved in making, in structuring, and in thinking about not just entertainment, but way beyond that into other forms of engagement. So we do everything from those things that you might think of as creative arts, like theatre and music, through into areas like public relations, media communication, and areas like social media, that really take very deep understandings. And so we offer students ways to engage with that, but also just recognising that they're going to be working in fields now that are transforming all the time, that they have to be agents of that transformation.
So it's creativity that is actually the basis of not just the sort of arts that people used to think about, but actually the basis of life itself, almost.
Of course it is. Any criticism that ever happens around creative practice not being necessary has been really interesting through this pandemic. This discussion of, you don't really need the arts, and what happens if the arts isn't there. Everybody is looking at streaming services. We know what happens if the arts isn't there, and that's that they have, no capacity to unwind, think about things beyond themselves, engage with the broader world. It's one of those strategies of doing that without having to have direct contact with people. And, it's incredibly powerful. And so I think we've seen how powerful it is, but also some of the risks, because a lot of people in the industry obviously have been really affected by this. And so, it's been a very powerful moment of seeing the importance and the truth of it, but also those risks.
It's a way of building connection. We talk in this project on creativity building resilience, but that resilience comes from a connection, and it's the connection that the economy, if you want to build it, is about people.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And it's about not just finding jobs for people, because that's one of the, the big areas of focus that government has, but also universities have, but also the broader population has. But actually it's about finding meaning in your life. and what creativity can do is to really support everybody in doing that. And I think that's why it's so powerful. And so people who are making and working in that space, they need to be connected. They need to be thinking about what the community needs. They need to be thinking, networking is crucial. It's you don't make without an audience, right? You don't do any work without having some kind of way that you get it out there. And that's the powerful thing, I think, about it.
It certainly is. And that connection and that being able to express to other people what you're saying is, of course, what the creative art of writing is. But there's so many other important ways of storytelling that you've been involved with. You've been working for the last few years, I think, on a project visiting museums?
Yeah. So for about 10 years, in fact, I've been working on a project that was also funded by the Australian Research Council and a number of other spaces as well, that looks at the way that that national museums of prominence, reflect and engage First Nations people's experiences, and that really represent and engage who people are. And it was no mean feat. I visited 470 museums in person, and it was a lot of work, but it was remarkable. And of course, museums they're just spaces. It's the people who work in them that I was talking to and that I was engaged with and that I was thinking about, and that had all of these remarkable things to say about the power of that. And of course, it always does come back to people and that idea of powerful stories, but also what audiences want, what visitors in the case of museums want, what they need to be able to see. So everything from disrupting stereotypes to reinforcing the importance of culture. So all of those things became, a really crucial moment and actually led to the current project that I'm doing in a whole lot of ways.
So it's what the audience gets out of the visit to the museum that becomes the story that they engage with that is the important thing. And that's...
I think it always is. It's a strange thing because when we look at something like a film, we start at the beginning and go to the end. But when you go into a museum space, you can engage with it in really different ways, and it's interesting to see what people value and what they need to get out of it. How long they need to spend there, how much time they engage with it becomes part of it. But of course, the crucial thing is what story is being told and being shared, and then how people can engage and understand that story as well. So,
from the perspective of the First Nation people, to what extent do you think that the museums are starting to acknowledge and recognise that they are the stories of the land that we have before the colonials' perspective?
I think for a long time museums have understood that. I think what they haven't done as well is understand that we continue to be a part of the story. And so I think they've often set it up as a kind of chronology, which is Aboriginal people here and now we're here, and it was a real problem in terms of that trajectory, I'd say. But I think there are also some very powerful processes with that. And of course, one of the really powerful things about thinking about that trajectory is that you have, people who are telling stories now, who are engaging in these spaces and who have a great deal of power within their own communities and who are telling those stories. And that's what changes and transforms. But yeah, museums have been terrible at it. Just like a lot of organisations. Universities weren't great at it, government wasn't great at it. Obviously, this is the colonial project, is about not really valuing who we are as Aboriginal people and not really understanding that. And so in a lot of ways, what's powerful about museums that then have, for instance, Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander curators in the context of Australia, is that it builds that. But there's also this wonderful work that's happening. Terry Janke, who's an amazing Torres Strait Islander lawyer and, who has a large firm that deals with creative practice problems, has come up with this roadmap that helps museums understand how they can move forward. And so that's what will change things, it's the community, yeah.
And it's that breaking down that compartmentalisation, that idea of there were First Nation people and now there's, what's now? But there's that continuity that you need.
Absolutely.
To reinforce.
It's the historicising is really easy when somebody else is telling someone's story. And this is the power of story. There's no question about it that areas like creative writing in particular have been at the forefront of how non-Indigenous people have come to understand what we value. But also, more importantly, I think, that it becomes the way that we express who we are. And we've seen it over the last 30 years, longer than that too, but definitely the last 30 years there's been this absolute boom in just us engaging in that creative writing space, and every year it's doubled. I mean, it's remarkable. So.
Well, for the last 2 years, First Nation people have won the Miles Franklin.
Absolutely, so, yeah. And there's just so much more work that's coming out. It's varied. It's not, the same old story. So, yeah.
Can I ask you to start telling us about your plans for the project that you'll be undergoing over the next 4 years.
Yeah, well, I think this is...
It sounds like an exciting project.
Oh, look, it's lovely. And this is actually the first time I've had a chance to talk about it because, of course, it was just announced a bit over a month ago. And it's an amazing project. Obviously, you spend a lot of time planning these ideas coming up to it. Now that it's realised, it's funding from the Australian government, and I think that's really crucial too. I think it's this understanding that this actually is something that is valued and that matters. There's also a massive input from USC, from University of the Sunshine Coast, where I work. They're providing not only quite a lot of money into it, but also just the support that you need to be able to make this happen over a period of 4 years. And so what the project is a chance to, it's called Saving Lives, and there's no hyperbole in that. It's important to recognise that for LGBTIQ plus, queer, First Nations people, one of the ways that you start to know who you can be as a person, particularly if you're in a family where there are no LGBTIQ plus people that you know of, or where you don't see that in your everyday, it's really important to be able to see people who are like you. And, so this idea of being able to look at the way that people are presenting themselves, and we know what happens in creative practice. Creative practice is powerful in that way, where we do it all the time when we look at TV and we see people who are like us and we go, oh, they're like us. That's a way to be in the world. And so obviously areas like screen are really crucial with that. But different art forms speak to different people, and so it's important to recognise that actually this is far more powerful than a pamphlet that says, oh, value yourself. Look, here's this is people engaging with the way that a character is thinking, with the way that a person is thinking through that process. And so this project, what I love about it, I love the fact that the government supported something that will absolutely have academic outcomes, but it's also got these massive creative practice outcomes. There's going to be an online space. There's funding to be able to provide creative work so to fund creative artists to make work that will go into this space. And of course there should be. I mean, what's the point of doing this if it's just documenting what's happened? Exactly. Let's also make.
So the research will not just lead to knowledge, but it will lead to an actual production.
That's right. And of course the knowledge is found in that too. And we know that. Like if I, with all due respect to the Academy, if I write something and I publish it somewhere, sometimes 100 people see it and that's great. If I put something out on the internet as creative practice and it contains that knowledge, we know thousands of people see it, and we need not academics to just see this. We need actually a kid living in a community to go, that's who I can be when I grow up.
A sense of inclusion.
A sense of inclusion and a sense that it's not as strong as the you're not wrong. It's not that idea of just validation. It goes beyond that. It's about knowing that you can thrive. And I think that's incredibly powerful.
Thrive and grow.
Thrive and grow.
And that's what the creative aspect is all about. And that's
absolutely.
What I think the whole aspect of your research will be, that it will enable people to grow from the space that they are in to the space where they want to be, that hope.
It's so crucial. LGBTIQ plus community generally has the highest levels of suicide in the community, and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people rival that. But when you combine the two, we actually don't have statistics on that, but we hope to. And we, and by we I mean not just me in this project, but other projects and other researchers who are working across this space. People like the folks behind Black Rainbow, for instance, just do remarkable work across this space. Indigenous X has done amazing work across this as well. And they're these incredibly powerful spaces that just go, we make, we show, we reflect, but we also need to be able to understand what we can do to help people see a future for themselves.
Can I just get you to talk a little bit about what Indigenous X are doing? Yeah. I'm not sure if they're involved in the visual dreaming app that is about to be launched later this month.
No, and I'm not too sure of that. So,
but yeah, if you could just talk.
Yeah,
about
Indigenous X is it's a remarkable platform. It's been going for a little over 8 years. Set up by Luke Pearson, and it started and has continued as a rotating Twitter account. What that means is that there, at 52 weeks of the year, every week there's a different Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander person who runs it, and they push whatever their own area is, their field is, their interest is, and they promote that through this account. There's a lot of people following. About something like a third of the followers are in the media area, and which is kind of wonderful. So it's a chance to get information out there about who we are, what we value, and it's really diverse, which means that we don't all agree with one another, of course, and that's exactly what you get when you have that kind of diversity being represented.
That's the nature of creativity.
It's the nature of creativity, but it's the nature of communities too. That whole, what's happened for a lot of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people is that we've been reduced into this idea that we all agree with the same thing and that we all, have these central ideas. And then when we don't, it's seen to be inconsistent or something. So this actually challenges that, which is wonderful. So, yeah.
And even more broadly, there's that view that the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are all one people.
That's right, exactly.
There's so many different nations.
So many different nations, but even within nations, there's diversity. Of course there is, because there is for everyone else, So it's naturally that. And that was one of the powerful things about the museums project that I did, for instance. And it's going to be a powerful thing about this project too, because it's about saying, this isn't what every Aboriginal person thinks, this is what one person thinks. Look at this. Look and think about the way that they're thinking about this. This is the way that a couple of people working together think. Look at the way that this works and understand it and grow from it. And again, it is that power of creativity, as you say, that it is about building. It is edifying. It is about not trying to, there's a lot of rhetoric around that idea of closing the gap. And while that's incredibly important, it's also important that we show when we're exceeding the gap, which we are doing at the moment in creative practice.
Absolutely. And I think to a large extent, a lot of people see the closing the gap in economic terms. But as you were saying right at the beginning with the creative industries from USC, the focus on our economy should be much broader than just what money people can make.
Yeah, exactly. And, the whole thing is that an industry is an industry is an industry. Of course, it comes down to whether people can sustain a living out of it. But there are so many different ways that you can engage. The more that people narrow into just one idea, and we see it in creative practice areas, many of us have to think about more than one stream that we're working across. And we're very capable of doing that. And that's one of the things that we do in creative industries, is that we prepare students for thinking well beyond the idea of one job name that they'll be doing for the rest of their lives. Not because that job isn't available or doesn't exist in that way, but because why limit it? If you're engaged in creative practice, it really is about creativity and dissemination, getting that info out there, but also engaging with people to do that and growing through that process. So,
Well, I think I want to take you back to the Indigenous X for a moment, and I think you've been involved in a lot of the project, and you've is it Indigenous X who will be publishing a piece that you wrote on your experiences recently?
No, it's actually not Indigenous X, though I am going to have a small piece in that, but it's another organisation, and they've got so it's actually led by Forum for Indigenous Research Excellence at Macquarie Uni, but a really wonderful relatively new publication called Journal of Global Indigeneity that really starts to look at what's happening globally. But one of the great things was, and I found this such a struggle to write, as I've expressed to you before, but they asked people to, they asked Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander academics mostly, to be able to write about their experience of the pandemic. And a lot of it was understanding what worked as academics with teaching. We've all moved into a kind of online space, then sometimes moved into an offline space, and then a combination of the two. And so it was understanding that, it was understanding the pressure and so on. But what happened for me was, I think, really remarkable and very helpful for me. At the time, I didn't see it that way, of course. And of course, it started off with an event that is not helpful for anyone, which is that, I had a lot of things happening in my life at the beginning of the pandemic. I had, I'd say my work wasn't great at the time, and it wasn't anyone I was working with, it was just me. It was just those internal machinations. And I think a lot of people felt that way at the time. It was, wait, what do I do now that I'm isolated in this way?
A sense of being overwhelmed and confused.
Overwhelmed and confused when I'd worked from home for 10 years. I mean, when I was in my last job, I was running a research centre at Batchelor Institute, and I'd worked centrally from Queensland and to the nation, so I should have known better than most how to do this. And so I also felt really guilty because I thought, wait, I know how to do this, I know how to do this kind of work. But I'd gotten so used to that idea of the network and the strengthening, and we were on this kind of pathway that I found it hard. But I also just had a lot of personal things. My mum has Alzheimer's, and she's in a care home. She's doing great, and she was doing great through all of that. But a big support for her was my brother, who was in hospital, my sister, who was very ill, who was also in hospital. And, we had a whole lot of things to deal with. I had, a whole lot of, I had some skin cancer treatment at the time, so I had a whole lot of issues around that. And a whole lot of issues around, being trans, and around one of the issues for some transgender people, and certainly for me, and I've been very open about it, is to say that I often feel gender dysphoria, and that was really manifesting in some very difficult ways. Anyway, I mean...
Do you want to just explain the gender dysphoria,
Sure.
just in terms of what that meant for you and the way you relate to, and people relate to you?
Yeah. Well, I mean, often what will happen is, I'm, I guess what some people might frame as assigned female at birth. And but I identify as non-binary transgender. And so a lot of it is people understanding my gender presentation, others kind of responding to it and supporting it and reinforcing it. I mean, I'm 54. I don't necessarily need a huge amount of external validation for things, but we all do for some stuff. And what I found was that I wasn't getting it very much at all. And it was hard. It's harder when you're at home alone, and I was living alone at home, and found that a whole lot of those manifestations were only happening in Zoom meetings, and they weren't very satisfying. So people were misgendering me. It was one of the sort of most obvious ones.
So people look at the surface reality and make a judgment.
And
that's the sort of thing that creates within you the conflict, if you like, the sense of disconnection.
Of disconnection, yeah. And at the time it was a pile-on of all of these things.
Which exacerbates the guilt you were feeling
over
absolutely. All of the other issues.
Absolutely.
You're supposed to handle it.
Precisely. And I, and so all of the things that I thought I was good at, I suddenly wasn't, and it was really disturbing. And so, so what I've said really publicly was that I tried to kill myself. And what was my moment after that was, I actually can't even believe that this happened now, but I'm just going to say it. Sorry, I'm laughing because it's so ridiculous that I did this, but about 2 hours later, and the interventions that happened for me were colleagues and friends, absolutely. And I was lucky that I knew how to reach out to people, that I was lucky actually just that I did lucky, it could have gone a different way. But a couple of hours later, I wrote an article. And I wrote it out, and I thought it might be garbage, I realised I don't write cathartic stuff normally, but this absolutely was catharsis. I actually went back and looked at it, it was pretty good, but of course in a lot of ways it was, because it was informed by all of the things that I knew. There was a sequence that made sense. thinking about what people need to read, I think it's incredibly important that when hard things happen, that you let people know if you can. If you're someone who can, and other people shouldn't feel like they have to do that. I just mean that it helps me do that, but also I think it can be a gift. I think it's incredibly important that we have that, that we have an opportunity to be able to engage in that way.
The piece that you wrote just after that event. You said your initial reaction to it was that, this could be rubbish.
Yeah.
Can I ask you if you feel that could be more the academic approach?
Yeah, totally.
And that the sort of writing you did in that piece was more of the human?
It was, but interestingly enough, it's not unusual for me to write my personal experiences within things. I'm very careful to say that that's what it is. It's part of the research that I do is to talk about the ownership of whatever your position is. And so it wasn't necessarily, and that's why I think it was confusing, because this wasn't a complete departure from the work that I do. I think if you're writing academic work and you don't bring the human into it, there's actually a problem with the work, especially when you work in my field and you're talking about culture and you're talking about representation. How can you not? And so, but when I went back and looked at it, it was pretty good. Objectively, I'm talking about, but also good in that broader sense. I wanted this to be something that would help people understand. I wanted to say, of all of the things that were happening, I'm there in a senior role at a university in a very safe job when all of my colleagues around me were losing their work. All of my, the industry that I work in were really struggling, and a whole lot of guilt around that stuff. It doesn't hurt to reveal that. It's not a mistake to be honest and to talk about that.
It's expressing the truth.
It's expressing the truth, but it's also, the risk is that it can be indulgent. Self-indulgent in a real way. Like it can be, the important thing was how I felt. It wasn't. The important thing obviously was how I felt in that moment, but it was also kind of recognising that lots of people are in this confused state at the moment. And one of the things that I did was actually talked about a couple of people that I know who, one person that I write about in it is Lisa Wadago, whose response to the pandemic wasn't to go, maybe she did go, I don't know what I'm going to do now. But she also immediately formed a Facebook group, thought about business, thought about how to stimulate and support Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander businesses in South East Queensland and across the country, and actually then put it into action. And sometimes when you can see that, but also I wanted to be able to reflect that. So that wasn't the event that happened, but it was a memory of, wow, that's a kind of modelling of what you can do. And, and I certainly did a little bit of participation in that, of thinking about trying to get us back onto an even keel as an industry, in the creative industries. And so I certainly did work towards that. And, the Australia Council piece that was on looking at the state of theatre and dance, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander theatre and dance, the report that's just come out, is a really remarkable report, but it was done before the pandemic. And Lydia Miller, who's the head of that area, just said, well, we still have to come. She did a beautiful preface for it and said, this is our reset. This is what we have to remember we were striving for before this, and we can't let it all go. We have to go, this is where we're going to go in the future.
So it's that sense of giving out your story, your truth that I said about, and the people you just mentioned, how they immediately gave out to the community some way of responding to our situation that all of us faced in, and I'm sure all of us went through that what the hell do I do now moment. That's the sense in which you did your writing, your piece, and this will be published?
Yes, so it'll be in the Journal of Global Indigeneity, which is actually freely available journal, which means people can read it. And what I meant before when I said it's not in Indigenous X is that there will be an article in Indigenous X that actually refers back to it. And so Look, one of the wonderful things about Indigenous X is as a website, it's got all of this material on there that reflects the difficulty of some experiences, also the wonders of some experiences. Was to recognise that the main writers who were being promoted were white writers talking about racism. I mean, the number one writer on the New York Times was Robert Angelo with White Fragility. That's what people were reading. They weren't reading black writers. And that worried me. And it worried me that there's so much amazing black writing that's happening in Australia, for instance. And so I came up with a list, tweeted it on each of the entries of it, on Twitter, but also put the list together for AusLit, for the Black Words, which is the very, remarkable site that just captures amazing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander writers. Very much a focus on creative practice, but also on all sorts of writing. And there's now a list on there that people can see if they want to read 100 different amazing writers who are writing everything from op-ed to creative work to, to journalistic pieces, to academic pieces. They can jump on there.
That authentic voice from the First Nation people.
Absolutely. And for people who've got skills in the area, so, there's like 13 journalists in there. It's this remarkable work. And people will often say, as an academic, I get a lot of folks saying, I just don't think there's anyone who's writing in the area. I've had many journalists, people who teach journalism, say that to me over the years. And now I can go, well, look, there's 13 of them on that list for a start, and here's some work that they're doing. So.
And it's that authentic voice that comes from a depth of experience.
Yeah.
It's not just your own personal experience, but your community experience.
Absolutely. There's a responsibility to community with it. Obviously somebody doesn't automatically have that. It depends on how they're connected. But one of the key things is that, it's important to have allies who are working across this space, and important to have people who are doing that work who are not Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, but we must have people who are as well. The difference is if somebody's non-Indigenous and they're working in that space, they can go home and leave it aside. We can't do that. We've still got family to be responsible to. And so there's actually some, as you say, truth in some of that work that operates a little differently. And also, just it's important. We know that there's not enough Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander writers out there, that we need to promote the wonders of the work that they're doing.
We need that diversity.
We need the diversity, and we need to acknowledge it too, and acknowledge that it's kind of a tricky space, but a space that's changing and just rapidly increasing. And things like the pandemic, we have to make sure it doesn't make it decrease. So,
Sandy, can I ask you to just explain that concept of symbolic annihilation for us and the way in which you challenge that?
Yeah, so, and again, it seems a little funny to be talking about challenging something that's this negative, to have this positive and this negative together, but just to explain what challenging the process of symbolic annihilation is, it's this idea of symbolism that we see all the time. When we read a story, we are asked to kind of take on understandings of a character. We often, especially when we're kids, teenagers, young adults, will try and see ourselves in those characters and kind of see that operates as a modelling.
We have our heroes.
We have our heroes. And
we play.
That's right. And sometimes we become them and they become us. When you don't have that, and I think for myself as someone who's trans and someone who's Aboriginal, and somebody who's 54, so I didn't have that growing up in the 70s and 80s. I didn't have that sort of experience. And there's a lot of people who feel that way now. They don't see themselves represented. And it's getting better and better. There's much more diversity in representation. But part of this is about talking about what Edelman, the amazing black activist, talks about as, if you can't see yourself represented, you can't be yourself. It's this incredibly powerful moment of recognizing not just the power of that, but also recognizing how it transforms what you get to do in the world. You see yourself existing for a start. So, annihilation, obviously we talked about that in the context of real annihilation, suicide, death, even the colonial project. But symbolic annihilation too, it's this remarkable process that we have of being able to see someone who's a little like us and being able to build that bridge. And of course, I think that's one of the reasons that so many creative writers and creative practitioners are able to do this wonderful work, is that they can have characters that are tangentially like them, that they've experienced, and make that journey towards them. And it's why it's so crucial that we have diverse representation in the writing as well as in the reading.
It gives you hope for the future, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. It gives you hope for representation that's real, that actually genuinely represents who people are in the world.
And that's your project over the next 4 years?
That's the crucial part of it. And of course what will happen is that there'll be wonderful art and making and reflecting on the work that's already happened, and just recognising how much wonderful stuff has already occurred and how much it's just blossoming now, and hopefully keeping it on track to post-pandemic. So
that will definitely build resilience.
I think one is resilient by recognising that there's strength in numbers, but also that there's strength in who you are in that network. And I think that's what it does. It says you're not alone, you're not isolated. There's somebody who's a little like you out there in the world, and this is how they got on. It's powerful.
A confidence in self comes from a confidence in community. So
absolutely, yeah.
So Sandy, thank you very much for being with us today.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you.
So we'll just keep chatting.